In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at order of operations or BEDMAS. So you probably have heard of this before and you probably are aware of it. But before we get into our lesson, I want you to try to solve some of these viral math problems. Right? So I won't show the answer, but just take a second and see if you can solve these problems. And these kind of pop up on social media every now and then, with lots of people having kind of conflicting answers. So they kind of become viral about which is the right answer. So again, just take some time, try to go through and solve one here. This one actually inspired a paper to be written about it, in terms of why there's kind of two different answers and which way should be the correct way. And again, another one, same idea. Again, like I said, these kind of pop up every now and then, with people trying to solve it and getting different answers. So all of those questions, the reason people probably get different answers is because they're not using order of operations or they're using it improperly. Right? So when people started to shift from using words to symbols in math, they needed to standardize a way in which different operations were applied. So mathematicians, people in general needed to come up with a consistent way or consistent order of operations, in terms of doing calculations. And this is important, especially when scientists and mathematicians started to use computers, because the computer needs to know, what do I do first? Right? Do I just read it left to right and do whatever comes first, or do I follow a specific order? So the computer needs to know that. So what they came up with was BEDMAS, or you might have also seen it as PEDMAS with a P instead of a B. Right? But essentially what it works out to is it tells us the order in which we have to do things. So B represents brackets. So we do our brackets first. E is exponents. Now for D and M, D is division. M is multiplication. It's not, it's different to writing it straight up and down. Multiplication. Multiplication. And with these two, it depends on the order. So when we're dealing with division and multiplication, it's whichever one comes first. And the same thing with the end, with division or with addition and subtraction. It's the same idea as division and multiplication, whichever one comes first. So for these last two, you would be reading it from left to right, and whichever one comes first. Whichever comes first. Right, so brackets and exponents we always kind of do first in the order. Division and multiplication, whichever one comes first when we're reading it. And addition and subtraction, the same thing, whichever one comes first. So let's just kind of go through some examples and work on using this order of operations. Again, this might be review for some of you. Great. If not, it doesn't hurt to kind of refresh our memories. So 7 minus 3 times x, or times 9. Wow, getting confused there. 7 minus 3 times 9. So I'm just going to write BEDMAS just at the top, just so we always have something to refer back to. So we don't see any brackets, we don't see any exponents. So we move on to division or multiplication. We do see some division first, so we're going to do that operation first. So we're going to leave the 7 minus 3 times 9 is 27. So 7 minus 27. Now we only have one operation left, and we get negative 20. We're at positive 7. We subtract 27. We go into our negatives. Right, so this is, again, important to know adding and subtracting integers, which we looked at in a previous lesson. For B, negative 9 minus 4 times negative 2 minus 6. So here we have a set of brackets first. So we want to solve that set of brackets, or we want to simplify what's in those brackets. So we're going to leave the negative 9 minus 4. The bracket is still going to stay there because we need that to separate the minus 4 with whatever this next number is. So negative 2 minus 6, we get negative 8. And now looking at it, there is a multiplication operation in here. And when we have a value or a number and it's attached to a bracket, or it's right next to a bracket like we see here, we imply, or it's implied that it's multiplication. So multiplication is one of those operations that you might not always see the times symbol for. Right? So when we have a number right next to a bracket, it means multiplication. That is also the next operation we're going to do. So we're going to leave the negative 9, and then we have minus 4 times negative 8, and there's two ways you can do it. One, you can just leave the minus sign and do 4 times negative 8, which is negative 32, and then simplify your double signs here to make it negative 9 plus 32. You could also take negative 4, so use the sign in front, which we generally should do. Use the sign in front, or make sure the sign in front is applied to the 4. So this is my entire term, minus 4 times negative 8. We have positive 32, right? A negative times a negative, and that would be our answer, or our simplified form. So different ways you can do it. I always like to use the sign in front and have it attached to the value, right? So that minus is attached to that 4. Then whatever my answer is, I just write it down. If it's plus or positive 32, I write plus 32. If it was a negative 32, I would just write minus 32. Last but not least, only one operation left, negative 9 plus 32. We are at positive 23. C, 3 squared minus 5 squared. So we have exponents. So these smaller numbers up top, these are exponents. So I have to do my exponents first. Remember, the 2 means, for exponents, means it's 3 times 3, or the number times itself. And then, in this case, twice. Minus 5 squared, or 5 to the power of 2, which is 5 times 5. Now, you don't have to write it out like this. I'm just writing it out just so that we have a reminder of what squared means. So squared means to the power of 5, or multiplied by itself twice. 3 times 3 is 9, and minus 5 times 5, which is 25. Now, again, you could just skip that middle step. You don't have to write it out if you don't want to. Again, I'm just showing you what the squared actually means. 9 minus 25 is negative 16. So there's only one operation left. Next one, 3 minus 5 squared. So this one is different because we have the set of brackets. So you might think it's similar to the last one, but it is different. I have to simplify the brackets first. So 3 minus 5 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is, if I want to expand it, negative 2 times negative 2, or positive 4. One thing to keep in mind, if you're entering this on your calculator, make sure you include brackets. And the reason I say include brackets is because on your calculator, if you do negative 2 squared and you do in brackets negative 2 squared, you will get two different answers. So negative 2 squared and then in brackets negative 2 squared, they are different. Just one thing to keep in mind. If we don't include the brackets, it is different. You will get two different answers. Now, with some of these complex kind of BEDMAS questions, if you're comfortable with your scientific calculator, you can enter these right into your calculator, and the calculator will go through the order of operations on its own. Now, you want to be careful though, because depending on your calculator, you might have to be very specific on how you enter it. Right? In some cases, you might be able to enter it exactly as you see it. And I would recommend, if you do have a scientific calculator, or if you're going to get one, I would include one or try to get one that shows everything that you're doing on the screen. Right? That way, when you enter everything in, for example, I just entered in brackets -11 or -11 plus 2 in brackets divided by -5 plus 2 squared plus 5, and I got my answer as 4. Right? So I should have an answer of 4. Right? I'm going to go through and we'll solve this one, and then the other ones we'll do on our own. I'll let you try on your own. I'll just enter the answer into the calculator. So we have in brackets first. So -11 plus 2 is -9 divided by -5 plus 2, which is -3 squared plus 5. I have -9 divided by, then we have 3 squared, so 9 plus 5. Then do my division. -9 divided by 9 is -1 plus 5 is 4. So I get the same answer going through it by hand as I did with my calculator. So try to go through the rest. Use your calculator to enter it in and see what you get. Right. So we'll go through. I'll do these on the calculator, and I'll kind of give you some hints as you're going through and doing them. Right. So if I have a fraction, right, remember that a fraction is essentially division. And when I have something on top and something on the bottom, if I'm entering this on my calculator, I want to put an extra set of brackets around everything on the top and everything on the bottom. This will tell our calculator to simplify everything on the top, simplify everything on the bottom, and then divide. If you're doing this by hand, you would simplify the top and bottom separately, then divide. So again, I'm just going to do this on my calculator. We will see what we get. And sometimes, again, depending on the calculator that you're going to get, you might be lucky enough to have a calculator that will allow you to enter things as fractions. So in my calculator, I'm entering it, and it's going to look exactly as I see it, with the fraction and everything. So again, if you can find one of those, they're usually not too expensive. It shouldn't be more than $20. It is going to be very useful because we get an answer of 2. And again, you're going to need a calculator for all 3 years of math, 4 if you take it in grade 12. So it is a useful investment. Another thing to note, this dot. This dot means multiply. And there are different kind of representations where we might see multiplication. We saw an example earlier with the brackets and a number next to the bracket. We might see the dot. We might see the X. We might see maybe a star. Right? It all depends. We usually want to try to move away from using an X to represent multiplying, only because when we start incorporating letters into our expressions and our equations, it can get complicated. So for C, again, I'm going to enter in my calculator exactly as I see it. In some cases, your calculator won't be able to put square brackets, but that's okay. You can still use regular round brackets to be the same thing. So in this case, we should get 12. Now, if you're doing this by hand and you're not using a calculator, when you have multiple sets of brackets, you want to do the innermost brackets first. So because I have multiple sets of brackets, I would want to do the 8 minus 2 first, and then I would do the 24 divided by whatever that answer is. For D looks again complicated. We're dealing with fractions. We have a lot of operations here. You could enter this into your calculator. And I'll just kind of rewrite it in a different way that you might see it. So on your calculator, a fraction again is just division. So you could rewrite this as 7 divided by 3 in brackets, then minus 4 divided by 5 in brackets, times 5 divided by 6 divided by 1 divided by 2 plus 1 divided by 4. I have a fraction button on my calculator, so it's going to be a little bit easier for me because I can just enter the fractions as is. And then again, depending on the calculator you have, you might have a calculator that will give you the answer as a fraction already. And again, that is very useful. It is a nice tool to have. I did not have that when I was younger. Probably would have been very helpful, but it takes away like having to work with fractions, and it makes it a lot simpler. So in the end, we should get 5 over 4, or if your calculator doesn't convert it to fractions, we should get 1.25. Now again, the only scenario with dealing with a calculator is that if you're entering it all in at once, there is room for error. Right? You might not type in it exactly, you might miss something. Again, that's why I do like the ones that show the actual steps. It shows the full expression. You're not just entering one number in, and then when you press add or subtract or multiply or divide, that number disappears. So you have to kind of remember what you entered. Right? So again, scientific calculator is very helpful, especially for some of these types of questions. Now, with some order of operations or with general expressions, we might have to substitute. And substitution just basically means replace a variable or a letter with an indicated value or with a number. So for example, the first one, we want to evaluate each expression if x equals -5. So all that means is that in my expression, so 4 in brackets x plus 3 bracket minus 1, I'm going to replace x with -5. So again, this -5 has replaced my x because this example tells me that x is -5. So 4 times, in brackets, -5 plus 3 minus 1. I'll go and do this by hand. Again, you could use your calculator. -5 plus 3 is -2. So 4 times -2 minus 1. I'm going to multiply first, get -8 minus 1, and I get -9 as my final answer. So all we're doing is replacing the value or the variable with a number and calculating or solving. B, same idea. Everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a -5. So 7 and what operation is going on? Is it going to be 7 minus 5, or is it going to be something else? Well, I have 7 and x side by side. Again, we had mentioned before, if we don't see an operation, we can assume it is multiplying. So this is the same thing as saying 7 times x, or 7 times whatever x is. This is the same thing as saying 2 times x. And the last one is just x on its own. But when we have a number and a letter side by side, we assume that the operation is multiplying. So to represent that, I'm going to do 7 and then in brackets, -5. Again, the -5 came from our question over here. So 7 times negative 5 plus 2 times negative 5 minus negative 5 plus 11. Keep in mind, similar to over here, just because the minus is there doesn't mean I don't have to put the minus from the minus 5. The minus here stays there because that's part of the expression. I'm just replacing the x. So the x disappears, becomes minus 5. I still have this minus here. Now I can go through and simplify. Right, I can do my multiplication first. Negative 35 plus negative 10. I'm going to cancel my double signs here. Plus 5 plus 11. And order of operations tells me to go left to right, whichever one comes first for addition and subtraction. So I have negative 35 plus negative 10, which is the same thing as saying negative 35 minus 10. So I get minus 45 plus 5 plus 11. Negative 45 plus 5 is negative 40. I'm getting more positive, and the plus 11 remains. So negative 40 plus 11 is negative 29. So that would be my final answer. Again, depending on how comfortable we are with our calculator, you could go right from here to the final answer. Again, depending on how comfortable you are with the calculator. In some questions, right, you might have to show all your work, so you will have to go through these steps, but that's a good way to check your answer, right, if you are comfortable with your calculator. The last thing we're going to look at is mean change. And mean change, we understand change is talking about like how much something changes, right? What the difference is. Mean, and we'll talk about this in a later unit, but mean just refers to as the average. Right? Mean is the average. So normally when we find the mean, we want to add up all our numbers and divide by how many we have. In some other situations, it might be a little bit different, right? But regardless, we still need to do order of operations when we're going through and doing these calculations. So the example we're going to look at 3 p.m., the temperature in Thunder Bay was minus 5 degrees Celsius. At 11 p.m., the temperature change was negative 29 degrees Celsius. What was the mean change in temperature per hour? Right, so if I want to find the average temperature change per hour, I need to look at what was the change in temperature and divide it by what was the change in time, right? Or what was the difference in time between my two measurements. Right? So in this case, we have two different kind of time windows. Right? 3 p.m., it was 5 degrees Celsius. That was my first time. And then the second time was 11 p.m. and negative 29. So when we're trying to find the change, we start with what our most recent value is. So in this case, negative 29. And we're going to subtract what the original value was, or minus 5. So when we talk about the change in temperature, we want to see what did it change by. So negative 25 minus negative 5. And we're going to divide that by the change in time. So 11 minus 3, because you might say it's currently 11 p.m. or the newest time is 11 p.m. The original time was 3. Because I have values on top divided by values below, I need to simplify the top first, simplify the bottom. I could do it at the same time, but I need to do that before I divide. So negative 25 minus negative 5 is negative 29 plus 5, which gives me negative 24, divided by 8 or 11 minus 3, which is 8. Now I can divide negative 24 divided by 8 is negative 3. So therefore, the mean change is negative 3 degrees Celsius per hour. So on average, the temperature changed or decreased 3 degrees per hour. So that is looking at order of operations. Again, hopefully that is something you are already aware of. You've heard of BEDMAS before. Hopefully you might have heard it again as PEDMAS with a P instead of a B. Still means the same thing, just a different word for brackets. They use parentheses instead, but it's the same general idea. Right? Just making sure we are able to go through and use order of operations when solving. If needed, make sure we are able to use a calculator and become comfortable using a calculator to either check our work or to do all these questions for us.